Hello, welcome to Political Capital. I'm Chris Bishop in for Karabo Letlatla. Now, the elections 2019 here in South Africa, everyone's looking forward to, and they're likely to be the most closely contested elections in the history of a democratic South Africa. Now, there's a new report that's been put out by the South African Institute of Race Relations, which gives a bit of, shall we say, a bit of food for thought on those elections and who might be likely to get votes, who likely might be in the lead, and who is going to get the most votes. Now, it's been written by a political veteran himself, a gentleman by the name of Gareth Van Onselen, the head of politics and governance at the South African Institute of Race Relations. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, I mean, everyone's saying that next year's election is going to be a cracker. What do you think as a political analyst?
I think next year's election is critically important for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a hugely significant test for Cyril Ramaphosa and his presidency and the condition of the ANC. Is it going to revert to a more centrist regime in the sort of Mbeki mold, or has the grip of sort of Zuma, demagogic impulses got the party by the throat? And the test of that is going to be 2019. It's a big test for the Democratic Alliance. It has to win another province, or there are no metros on the table, another province, preferably Gauteng, to be able to establish itself as an official opposition and keep its forward momentum that it's got in the other elections. And then there's the EFF, which has staked its whole reputation on being, the defining influence in South African debate. And whether or not its politics are going to play out as having had that effect, we'll see in 2019.
Well, let's have a look at some of the figures. I mean, also some of the research you've done is into the land issue, which we'll talk a lot more about in the second half. But let's just have a look, see how you think it stacks up. And I'm going to ask you then how you did your research and where you get your numbers from. But you're saying at this stage, the ANC at the next year's election would like to get 52% of the vote, the Democratic Alliance, 23%, and the Economic Freedom Fighters, 13%. Now, by that calculation then, you're saying the EFF should get something like 2 million votes next year.
Well, just to be clear, this poll is not a prediction. It's a snapshot in time. So what it shows you is the current voter sentiment. And that stuff is by no means set in stone. There's a big election to come, which obviously will have a huge influence on the way in which people decide to vote on election day. And bearing that in mind, those are the numbers that we've shown. The big finding is obviously the EFF on 13%. That is a huge increase from 2014, more than double. There's 6% they got then. And the question is, how have they managed to grow to that degree? Because all their votes seem to have come at the expense of the ANC. And I think that's the key finding in the survey. I mean,
we're talking here, because the one thing, I covered the 2014 election, and one thing that shocked me was that they launched 3 months before on a protest movement and a prayer, shall we say, and they got more than 1 million votes on the day. Everyone was stunned. I was at the IEC in Pretoria. Everyone was stunned on that day. How likely is it, you think they could get more than double that next year?
Well, it all depends on the ANC, to be frank. I think that the EFF's support has come from the ANC, which is easily demonstratable by the fact that the ANC's dropped from 62 to 52%, and those 10% of voters must have gone somewhere. The EFF's the only party to grow, so they most likely have gone there. And I think the fact that they've switched side is a combination of factors. The first one is that the EFF has been able to lead the ANC by the nose on a whole lot of big issues, from land reform to state banks to a whole range of other things. People perceive it as being in control, powerful, and well-led. Secondly, as you say, I think there is an element of protest vote in there. There are a lot of people that are very angry with the ANC and alienated, and they think the best way to demonstrate to the ANC their anger is to vote for the EFF.
And talking about the land debate, I say we'll talk a lot more in depth about it in the second half, but surely I thought that day when Cyril Ramaphosa in Parliament said, no, we're going for land expropriation without compensation, there was a round of applause from the men in the red suits in Parliament, the EFF. I thought at that point, he's spiked their guns now. They haven't got this big issue to use. What do you think's happened there?
Well, the poll suggests that it's backfired horribly. The ANC's strategy, to one degree or another, was to try and nullify this EFF very radical populist impulse coming in from the left by adopting their strategies and having a kind of amorphous process which could slowly incorporate them and eat up their capital. But it's backfired because the EFF have maintained their line. They've been very firm on it. They haven't compromised, even when people are tending more towards, constitutional hedges on what the final position will be. And it's worked. People have, alienated voters, at least from the ANC, have gone with them and not the ruling party.
And in terms of campaigning, I mean, a lot of it is around Julius Malema, the man himself, the man who's the face of the party. Do you think that they've been working hard enough in 2018 to get these more disgruntled voters from the ANC, maybe even the DA as well?
Well, I think they've totally dominated national debate. And the point is illustrated by another set of questions that we asked in the poll, a fairly standard question, which is, what do you regard as the biggest issues as a voter? And typically people list the economy number one. It came out number one in this poll, 47%. The other big sort of common issues, healthcare, education, crime, corruption, all featured at the top. Land reform came in at number 6. So you have to ask how it is that they've managed to get to 13% on an issue essentially that most people don't regard as a priority. And the answer is there's a total vacuum of leadership on those big issues, compounded by the fact that we have, a crisis in education, a recession, healthcare imploding. Malema and land reform stand out like a shining beacon, and it's attracting voters to them.
But if we wind back a few years, I mean 2011, 2012, I remember standing in awe outside the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, just a few hundred yards away from where we're sitting, and watching thousands of EFF supporters pack the streets that day and come marching down Oxford Road. You could not see anything else but red and white. Some of the demonstrations and popular demonstrations they put together, I think, really caught the eye, but I haven't seen so many this year.
No, there have been far less this year, but I suspect you'll start to see a lot of that stuff as the election campaign swings into action. But the EFF hasn't actually needed to do that as far as publicity goes. Their ability to dominate Parliament and the media and processes like the land reform process means they get a hugely disproportionate amount of coverage and they can afford to do that. Any radical demagogic party is not really constrained by the sort of measured reasonableness you need if you're the official opposition or in government. And they can drive these hugely sensational wedge issues. That said, they are very good at mobilizing on the ground, and they don't publicize that stuff, and I'm sure they're hard at work making their branches work and getting people together for an on-the-ground campaign ahead of 2019.
Well, speaking about mobilizing on the ground, do you think they've got the muscle, though, to pull a turnaround next year? Because, I mean, you look at it, in more than a century of operation, the ANC has got a little office and an organizing team in every tiny community across this entire country.
Yes.
It's been built up over a century. The EFF still hasn't got that. No,
I would agree with that 100%. And this is going to be the test of the election campaign. And it doesn't just apply to the EFF, it applies to the DA as well. The ANC's ability to be able to organize on a grassroots ground basis, branches, communities, send out thousands of activists to canvass and mobilize support is unprecedented. And they're also going to have a lot more money, as are the DA than the EFF, and both those things are going to be brought to bear on that 13%. So it's going to be a real test for the EFF to see if it can hold on to those people.
And looking further ahead, where do you think it's going, the EFF? I mean, are they going to sit around for, I mean, one thing I do recall from the 2014 election, the DA people saying we get an extra few percent every year, another 10, 20 years we won't be in power. Yes. That was the joke of the day. But do you think that's where the EFF wants to go?
Well, the EFF has got a big decision to make in terms of its long-term prospects. It's the price you pay for fashioning yourself as sort of the ANC's radical conscience is that essentially what you're saying is we want the ANC to work. We want it to be a more radical revolutionary party, but we want it to follow our lead. And that would suggest if you can achieve that, then ultimately you can go back into the ANC and, join on common ground. However, if your role is to stand as an independent party in and of yourself, they've got a problem, because if they fail in this election to hold on to that 13% or to demonstrate that they are the revolutionary conscience of the ANC, then what is the point of them? And voters are going to come to that conclusion if they don't get a lot of votes.
And just going back to those figures, ANC 52% in next year's elections, DA 23%, EFF 13%. A lot of people out there watching, I'm sure, will be asking the question, where did you get your figures from? How did you come up with this?
Yes, well, the poll was, there are a few things that distinguish this poll. The first one is that it was only registered voters. A lot of polling in South Africa just polls general members of the South African populace. We stuck to registered voters, which obviously gives you a far more accurate number in terms of sentiment, because those are the people that matter on the day. Secondly, we distributed undecided voters. In other words, people who didn't know or refused to answer were given a party affiliation based on how they voted on favorability towards a party. So if they felt 50% or more favorable towards the DA but were undecided on who they'd vote for, we put them in the DA category. The poll was conducted by phone. It was in the field from the 22nd of August to the 4th of September, so it's fairly recent. Fully demographically representative, and I think it is one of the most accurate methodologies out there at the moment.
How many people did you talk to, you think?
It was 978 registered voters, which gave us a margin of error of 3%, which is pretty standard for a national sample. That margin did increase to 6% because we pulled a Gauteng sample out, and in Gauteng no party was on 51%, but that's a 6% margin of error, so you have to be a little more careful with those numbers.
And how difficult was it, I mean, to get this whole thing and audit it, and how long did it take you?
Yeah, a poll is quite a lot of work. I mean, you have to come up with a script, and you can't waste questions in a script because people are only willing to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. So you have to make each question count, and you have to have a clear idea of what questions are going to give you the most insights into the election. So getting the right script is important. You have to make sure you have all the relevant demographic categories so you can work out by race, income, gender, education, what people's views are on these subjects. Then you put the poll into the field. It takes about a month to do all the interviews and generate a random sample. And then you get a huge data spreadsheet, and you have to pull out from it the requisite information. So it's quite a lot of work.
But have you had any challenges yet from your findings so far?
Well, the challenges are obviously the nature of the poll. Any poll can only tell you what its methodology allows it to tell you. So obviously it's not predictive. We don't have a huge sample, so we couldn't pull out, unfortunately, provincial samples for the Western Cape and KZN, which would have been particularly interesting. And we couldn't generate a number of turnout scenarios. We could only do one, which we should talk about just now, on 83%, which obviously has a big impact on the election. We would have liked to have done some lower turnout scenarios, but unfortunately we couldn't on this particular sample.
Okay, I'm talking to Gareth Van Onselen, the Head of Politics and Governance at the South African Institute of Race Relations. We'll be talking land very soon. We're talking the 2019 elections next year and some of the research into how people's minds are working ahead of that. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back with more on the other side of this. You're with Political Capital. Welcome back to Political Capital, the intersection of money and politics. You're still with me, Chris Bishop, in for Karabo Letlatla, and my guest is Gareth Van Onselen, the Head of Politics and Governance at the South African Institute of Race Relations. You've been out there phoning people, knocking on their doors, taking a dipstick into their minds ahead of the 2019 elections. We talked in the first half how the votes might go. In this half, you've asked a lot of questions about land or expropriation without compensation, which is the top of the news right now, EWC as you call it. And interestingly, you say that 20% of all the voters you talk to, they'd never even heard of it, which makes it strange, such a big issue.
Yes. Look, so we asked a series of questions, about 5 questions on land reform and different elements of it: property rights, expropriation without compensation, alternatives to that policy, to try and gauge voter sentiment on the issue. And the key question up front, or at least one of the defining questions, was, to establish whether you'd heard about this hugely divisive issue, which is dividing the whole country, expropriation without compensation. And 27% of voters said they'd never heard of it. So that tells you to a certain degree the kind of bubble we live in the media and on social media and places like that. There are just vast tracts and numbers of people out there who don't know what the policy is or what it stands for.
And also, you're saying 41% of all the voters who have heard of it somewhat or strongly oppose it. I mean, you would think if you read the papers that the whole nation was behind this thing. I mean, what do you think that is?
Well, consistent through almost all of the questions is a pool of around 30% of voters who are favourable or amenable to the idea of expropriation without compensation, or its various surrogate forms. In other words, the state owning all land or land being taken away from white South Africans without compensation. That's quite a big pool, and it's quite disturbing for such a radical position. However, and this is the most powerful finding in the land questions, when you put that question to voters with regards to their own personal circumstances, in other words, you say, would you approve of government coming to take your land? That position just collapses, and 90% of all voters are strongly opposed or somewhat opposed to that position. In fact, 86% are strongly opposed to it, and that's across all demographics.
Because that's one of the great arguments, isn't it? I mean, people say now in conversation, they'll say, oh, well, how do you feel about your leasing your house now? I mean, it seems to have gone right to the roots of the economy, and foreign investors are looking at it with a degree of trepidation.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the inability of anyone in government or in the ANC to fundamentally define what their position is has left all doors open to how this thing could end, and it is playing havoc with our economy and economic sentiment. And it's one of the reasons why people are somewhat confused or don't know what the policy is, because frankly government doesn't seem to know either.
Another finding you got, the 51% of all voters believe there should be an alternative, and 17% believe that no land reform is necessary. So where does this stand on this idea of a groundswell? People need land, everyone wants their land back.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, what the poll suggests is that the sort of 30% that are favourable to this idea, which is enough to dominate national debate if they're radicalised, are actually manufactured. And they don't really believe in the kind of things that the EFF, for example, is promising. It's just sentiment and a euphemism for a whole lot of other prejudices and fears, and you know, the consequences of things like unemployment and poverty levels. But it's not actually heartfelt. When you say to people, if this involves your land, how do you feel? They're not interested.
Just a question, and put you on the spot here. I mean, you're a journalist. You've been in politics as well in this country. I mean, everyone's complaining about this idea of land being taken without compensation, but what would be your answer to it?
Well, I don't think there's any need to meddle with anything. I think the mechanisms for land reform are perfectly sound, reasonable and rational. But as with every single element of the South African state, they have failed because of incompetence and corruption on the part of the governing party. And if you had competent people in there, if you had the right political will, the skill and the money behind this process, you could make a fundamental difference to the way in which land reform takes place in South Africa. Only it's fallen apart, and because it has, like everything else, it's been jumped on by a party that has used it for nefarious ends, and it's playing havoc with our national debate.
And surely another question is, it's more about productivity of land than it is about actual ownership of land. It's very fine that some of the critics I've seen have said, well, it's all very well to give people land, but you need to do something with that land to make the country prosperous.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a fundamental myth that the likes of the president are espousing, that, you know, if you put a whole lot of people on the land and equip them to become farmers, this is going to make a massive contribution to our economy and turn around our growth rate. There is no evidence to support that. Not just because it won't make an impact in terms of hard economic growth, but people are not interested in farming the land. South Africa is urbanizing. People are moving away from rural, areas into urban centers. That's where jobs are. The economy is modernizing, not, becoming an agrarian economy. And that's, where the future lies.
I'm going to say something like 6-7 months before the elections. What do you think could happen in the run-up to the elections? If the ruling party wanted to make a solid statement on land and show the people they were serious, surely there's going to be some major announcement in the run-up to the elections next year.
Well, they're kind of subject to the processes that they've set in place now. So whatever the Constitutional Review Committee arrives at, the ANC is going to be bound to follow. It's tied all of its, it's put all of its credentials on that process, and what it arrives at, that will define its lead. So it's kind of held hostage by that process. The EFF has been given free rein to carry on as it is, and no one is talking about the issues that matter: the economy, education, healthcare, crime, corruption, things like that.
And also 31% of all the voters believe, as in the Freedom Charter, all land in South Africa should be owned by the government or shared by the people, as it said in the Freedom Charter. Also, I think that, do you think that people are seeing this as the issue in the elections next year?
No, absolutely not. As I said before, I mean, there are a whole lot of issues that outrank it. And the fact that it is so dominated is a consequence of poor leadership on the part of the governing party and the official opposition. I mean, one of the other implicit findings of this poll is it's quite damning of the DA in the way in which it's conducted itself. It should be providing a counter-narrative to the EFF. It should be dominating on issues like the economy and attracting alienated ANC voters to the party. But its inability to do that and to lead debate in the way that the EFF can, you know, it's resorted to being a responsive party to almost everything the ANC does, is costing it. It's not winning the votes that it should.
And last but not least, I mean, the EFF was the surprise package of the 2014 election. What are the chances of another party coming from nowhere next year in the very, very turbulent political climate we're in?
Well, look, as I alluded to earlier, one of the findings of the poll was in Gauteng, no party was on a majority. We had the ANC on 48, the DA on 28, and the EFF on 17, which, as an aside, tells you the bulk of the EFF support is coming from Gauteng because it's our most populous province. But if that does happen, that there is no majority in Gauteng, a whole lot of small parties in that province could play a very big role and become kingmakers or define a coalition, align themselves with the ANC or the DA and cause huge uproar. That kind of scene is certainly set for small, sort of usually minority disregarded parties to become front and center.
So certainly it's going to be a very interesting election in 2019. Thank you very much. That was Gareth Van Onselen from the Institute of Race Relations talking about votes for next year's election and also the land issue. Before we leave, let's take a quick recap of the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture.
The judge has yet to hear back from the former #1 citizen of the country. Former President Jacob Zuma was asked by Zondo to submit a version of events in an affidavit or give testimony. So far, Zuma is biding his time. But the young Zuma is not so shy. The one-time business associate and close friend of the Gupta family, Dlamini-Zuma, is preparing to wage war on Jonas. He accused Dlamini of being a facilitator of the famous or infamous meeting where Jonas was allegedly offered the finance minister's job with a 600 million rand bribe. The judge granted him the right to cross-examine because he would also be testifying and giving his version of events. Controversial businessman Fana Hlongwane is also to cross-examine witnesses like Jonas and former ANC backbencher Fakey Mentor. Both have accused him of being an accessory to state capture. Mentor will also be cross-examined by Jacob Zuma's former chief of staff, Laleka Kaunda. Mentor accused Kaunda of setting up the meeting where Mentor was offered a job as a public enterprises minister. As it stands, we've had more experts than witnesses, but it is only a matter of time before the former and current Treasury men will line up to give testimony. On October the 3rd, the returned Minister of Finance, Dlamini, will take the stand and tell of what many will be keen on hearing, the pressure on Treasury to push through the nuclear deal. This pressure saw Nene getting the boot during a midnight shuffle and replaced with weekend Special Finance Minister Des Van Rooyen. On the 10th of October, former Finance Minister and now Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan is expected to paint a picture of his second stint in Treasury when he was brought back to save a nosediving currency and plunging stock markets. The minister is expected to give details about the rot in the system during his second stint and also about the constant harassment trying to force him to vacate his post. Former Public Enterprises Minister Barbara Hogan will take the stand 3 days after Gordhan and will detail the work within the state-owned entities until she was fired in late 2010. But a growing number of voices are calling on the former Premier and current ANC Secretary-General Ace Magashule to account for his spending with the now-defunct Gupta TV station and newspaper. Also, for the ANC National Chairperson to account for the intimidation of bankers who refused to do business with the Guptas. The list is likely to lengthen with every passing week, yielding testimony that is likely to make headlines.
That's where we leave it for today's edition of Political Capital. Be sure to watch again on Thursday. From me and the team, it's bye for now.